back. In this video, we're going to be going over the table elements. This is going to be the first part of a 5-part series on tables. In this video, we're going to just introduce tables. We're going to connect our tables to a data source. For this first video, it's going to be a static data source. And in upcoming videos, we're going to go over more concepts like pagination and server-side pagination, and so on and so forth. All right, I'm currently in the app builder. To get to a table, I just have to go into my elements, and I'm just going to go to the component section and just drag in a table. All right, so there you have it. I have an empty table. If I look into my element hierarchy, I can basically see my table. Within my table, I have the header row. I have the filter row, which is an optional row. I have the data row wrapper. Within it, it's just going to be the table data row. I have my pagination with all the fields. So, everything is within reach. Everything can be touched, styled, and you can add logic to just about everything. All right, so for tables to display data, they need to be connected to a data source. If I were to just jump back into the hierarchy and select my table, I'm currently in the element settings. So let's just take it from top to bottom. So we have the app data field, which is basically the field in our app data that is binded to our table. We have the manage data flow. It's set to false by default. So basically, if we set the manage data flow to true, it just simply means that we have to provide the data for our table. All right. In this case, it's false, meaning that whatever field that we point to in our app data is what the system is going to use to map to our table. All right. We have auto-generate by default is true. So what this is basically doing is that whenever we connect it to a data source initially, the table is going to go ahead and just generate a brand new table with all the columns based on the data set. And then after that, you get to then hide some columns or delete some columns just based on whatever your preference or your logical requirements are. Show filter row. This is optional. This is false. If you wanted to have like a table that had an embedded filter for every single column, all you will need to do is set this to true. The system is going to take a look at the data, right? And based on the data type, it's going to determine what the filter should be. Should it be a switch? Should it be an input? Or should it be a number input, right? It's all going to be based on the data type. All right. Use pagination. As you can see, pagination is true by default with tables. If you turn this off, then you lose that pagination. By default is true. If you just wanted to show a list of elements without pagination, a list of like row data without pagination, let's say you had something very static that was maybe only going to be like 5 rows or whatever, then of course you go ahead and turn the pagination off because it's not required. All right. So server-side pagination false by default. In a future video, we're going to go over server-side pagination. We have a display limit of 10. Table pagination metadata field, which is basically the field in our app data that the system is going to store the pagination metadata. This is only valid for server-side pagination. The table data row count, which is basically the total number of our data sets. Again, another attribute that is only valid for server-side pagination. Link pagination to router just means that we want to link the pagination to the router. This is similar to what we do in the list elements, right? So basically, this field will be in our router, and it's going to be tracking the page index. All right, so we have a couple fields here: scroll width field, scroll height field, scroll top, scroll left field. And these are simply fields that we use for scroll pagination. All right. If you wanted to, let's say, run whatever kind of logic you wanted to run, but ideally, you wouldn't need to do anything extra with regards to scroll pagination. The system handles the logic of triggering for you. Here we have, title, draggable. These are just both your standard HTML5 attributes. It's non-reactive. It's something that we've covered before with lists. This just simply means that we don't want the table to react to data changes. For tables, this is probably always going to be false because you want your table to react to data changes. And then the display options, 5, 10, 20. This is basically just the display limit selector options that we have here. So if you wanted to add things to it, you can. If you wanted to remove options from it, you can as well. All right. And then our columns, right? Our column builder. So this is how we manage columns. All right. So now we've gone over everything. Let's just start and build up a standard static table. All right. So I'm currently using a service called Random Data API to basically generate some random data. All right, I currently have this up here. It's currently generating 10 records. I'm going to just change this to 45. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and copy this data set. All right, perfect. I'm going to go back into my application and I'm going to go into my initial data. I'm going to set a field called user list. I'm going to paste in that data. All right. So I'm going to save this. I will refresh. And whenever the app loads, it's going to load that initial data into our live data. Perfect. All right. So now I have a table and I'm just going to bind this table to that user list. And now because of the auto generate is set to true, it's going to automatically generate this table. So I'm just going to point it to user list. There you have it. So the system recognized a new data set that is an array. And it then went ahead and created this table based on all the columns, right, that we have in that array. And whenever it's an object, like we have for like employment, address, or credit card, it's basically just converting that object to like text and displaying it like text, right? All right, so if you were to look into the table element hierarchy, you have every single element within your table is within reach. You can always go in there, change the styling, add whatever logic you want to add to any parts of it. If you, let's say you wanted to change the width, right, of the column, right? So by default, the system is going to look at all the columns. And if it's, let's say, exceeding the number of columns that maybe percentages will suffice, then the system will go ahead and practically just use 150 pixels to determine the width. So you can go ahead and change that if you want to. And the child columns or the child column cells will inherit whatever width the column header has. If we go back to our table for a second, I did mention a filter row that was optional. If I were to turn the filter row on, as you can see, I have, this new row that has inputs. If you wanted to connect these inputs to some kind of filter logic, you can go ahead and do that. If you wanted to use filters that were external to the table, you could always just go back into your table and just turn off the filter row, right? And then use an external, maybe input or an external set of drop downs, whatever. Do the custom filter widgets for your table data. All right, so let's go ahead back into our table. It's already selected. If I were to scroll all the way to the bottom, I can see the columns, all right? And off the top, if I wanted to just delete a column, I can just go ahead and click on delete column and it's pretty much gone. Let's just keep doing that for a few of these columns. Okay, let's see. Let's edit this one. Let's reduce this to, let's call it social. Let's update that. I'm just going to go ahead and delete it. Perfect. So now I have columns that fit the page. All right, perfect. So let's go ahead and hide a few columns. So if I wanted to hide a column, all I would just need to do is let's say, click on the column and click on the manage visibility, right? And basically just turn that off and update, all right? But if we go back to it just really quickly, as you see, this is, a script user interface. So ideally, you could have these columns be visible or hidden based on some logic, right? So you could say something like, let me just do something random. We say like parameter dot app underscore data dot, let's say, user list dot length is greater than, call it 100, true, else false, right? So you can do something like this. You could add some logic to your tables to show or hide columns, right? You have the ability to do that. And the column is going to be reactive whenever these conditions are satisfied. Your logic is going to execute and the appropriate values are going to be reflected. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and change this back to some static Boolean and just update. So now it's hidden. All right. So if I wanted to, let's say, hide the UID column, I could do that as well. I could basically just come here and I just hide it, updates. If I wanted to move columns around, let's say I wanted to move the ID to the position of the password, I can just drag that, right? And now we've switched positions and I can always just drag it back. And now we've gone back to the original position. If I wanted to, let's say, edit something, if I wanted to edit the column name, I can do that from here. I could say ID, right? Now, this is an internal identification, right? This is not the same as this text block. So for your column headers, all you just need to do is go in there and just change the actual text. So if I wanted to change this to user ID, I could just change that to user ID. So user ID, right? And if I want to change this to password, I could do the same thing, right? With this text block 19, or I could just double click into it and do the exact same thing. Let's say we wanted to change that P to capital P. There you have it, capitalized. Change the first name to first name, double click into it, first name. Same thing here, I could just go over here to the static text and change that to last name, right? Same thing with username. Right, email, I could just double click on it and just delete the E, change that to capital E, right? So, there you have it. We have this very, very good looking table. As you can see, it's a little bit undersized. We've basically deleted a bunch of columns and now our table is somewhat lopsided. And this is because the table was generated with default widths in the columns of 150 pixels. As you can see, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I have 8 columns. So we could just do the math, right? We could just do 100% divided by 8. That's 12.5%. So I'm just going to go ahead and set each one here to 12.5% width, so that we can just have that even distribution in your applications. You get to distribute it and size it to whatever makes sense to you. So I'm going to change this here to 12.5%. Change this here to 12.5%. And do the same here. If you notice, whenever we click on the column header, the table refreshes, and that's just the built-in sorting function that triggers. But here we don't have any sorting logic, so it does nothing, right? The table triggers it, but there's no end results because we haven't configured anything. And we're going to look at that in future videos. All right, so 12.5. percent. All right, 12.5%. Almost done. 12.5%. And the final one, 12.5%. All right, so now if I save this and refresh, we have our columns all perfectly aligned with the headers. And the reason why I use percentages here is that I might want to, resize my table. So I have this table currently full width. If I wanted to just click on my table and let's say change it to a width of, call it 80%, right? There you have it. It's already perfectly centered. If I put some margin on top, call it 30 pixels. All right, so here you have it. I have my table resized. If I go ahead and refresh, now it's back to being perfectly aligned, all right? Because of the way it works is that the column header is going to calculate its real width in pixels, and then the column cells are going to inherit that width, all right? So that's pretty much it for rendering this table. Let me go ahead and just do some quick things just to show you how to work within tables. Even though if this is just some static data, I'm going to go back into my table, click on it. I'm going to go into the columns. I'm going to take my avatar. I'm going to make that the first one, the first column. All right. And let's see, I'm going to go into my, call it row data. I'm going to click on that. All right. So there's no heights, meaning that it's always going to take on whatever heights the children have. I'm going to look into the individual row. So there is a height here of 40 pixels. I'm going to change that to, let's say, 60 pixels. All right. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I want to see some breathing room. You know what? It doesn't even matter. I'm just going to go ahead and delete this text block from my avatar. I'm going to go ahead and drag in an image. All right, I have an image here now. And if I were to click on the column cell, you can see this is the flex display, centered. This is just the standard styling. You can always change, every single thing. So I'm going to go ahead and point this image to our avatar. And when you're working with tables, one thing that you need to know is that the individual fields are binded to a parameter called, the rows, right, are binded to a parameter called list item data. So if I were to map into my data set, which is our random data, if I was trying to map into the avatar field, right, I'll be mapping into the row data first, and then I'll be mapping into the actual field. All right, so here I'm going to use code. Let me just expand this. I'm going to say parameter dot list item data. So notice that in this example, we are not mapping into app data. We could, but that will be a roundabout process. We already have by default the list item data in our reach, right? And I'm going to just say avatar. Okay. If I close this, as you can see, I basically binded to the avatar. If I were to click on all these other text blocks, you would notice that they're all mapping to the list item data. The system does this mapping for us automatically. You can change it if you want to, but it's always mapping to the list item data. And just more of this, if you go into the function builder, just pick a function here. When you look at the list of system generated parameters, right? As you know, we already have the app data. But we have for lists, in list, list item data, and the list item index, right? So that's pretty much what we've mapped into, the parameter list item data, right? And as you can see, this is clients only, right? And that's why we're able to map into it from here. All right. So this is pretty much it for this video. We've basically dragged and dropped the table. We've connected it to some static data. We've rearranged the columns. We deleted some, we hid some. We resized our columns by setting the size in our column header. We know that the column cells are going to inherit whatever the width of the column header is. We basically moved or repositioned our avatar column. We worked on mapping to some data within our table, right? We went over the individual attributes of our table elements. As you can see, we also talked about the filter row and how it's optional, all right? So that's it for this video on the basics of tables. I'll see you in the next one.